The phone rang at 3 a.m. Maria's heart jolted in her chest as the shrill sound cut through the stillness of the night. It felt as if the walls themselves held their breath, waiting for the call to be answered. She didn't want to pick up. Who would call at this hour, and why now? But something inside urged her to reach for the receiver, something she couldn't explain. The moment her fingers brushed the phone, her pulse quickened. She wasn't ready for this. Not tonight. But the moment the phone stopped ringing, she felt a strange emptiness in the air. Hello? Her voice was groggy, unsteady. Maria. I need you to come home, the voice on the other end whispered, gravelly and urgent. She froze. It was her mother's voice. But something was wrong. The calm she had always associated with her mom's reassuring tone was gone, replaced by a tremble that sent chills down Maria's spine. Mom? What's going on? Maria asked, now fully awake, sitting up in bed. Why are you calling me at this hour? There was a long pause. Then her mother spoke again, her voice barely audible. Something's wrong. I need you to come home. Now. Maria's throat went dry. Something in her mother's voice told her it wasn't a simple request. Something was terribly wrong. I don't understand. What's happening? She tried to steady herself. The years of silence, the distance, the unspoken tension between her family and her, all of it seemed to crash down in that moment. You won't believe it, Maria, her mother continued, her voice breaking slightly. But you need to come home. Please, don't ask questions right now. Just come. Maria's mind raced as she struggled to understand what was happening. Over the years, her relationship with her family had been fractured. She hadn't spoken to them in months, and the last time they tried to reach out, her mother had left her an emotional voicemail, begging for forgiveness, but Maria couldn't bring herself to call back. It was too painful. Too complicated. But this felt different. The desperation in her mother's voice wasn't something Maria could ignore. Okay, Mom. I'll be there, Maria said, her voice shaking, though she hated to admit it. She didn't want to go back to the house. Not after everything. But she had no choice. The drive was the longest she had ever endured. The familiar streets outside her window seemed to blur as she focused only on the road ahead. Her thoughts were racing. What had her mother meant by, something's wrong? Was it her father? He had been sick for years, but this felt different. She remembered the old house, the family home, where she grew up. The memories came rushing back in flashes, her mother's laughter, her father's stern yet loving demeanor, her brother's mischievous smile. She hadn't been back in years. The house had stood empty for most of that time, the walls echoing with silence after the family fell apart. But now, she was returning. And she didn't know if she was prepared for what waited there. When she finally reached the house, the sight of it sent a wave of dread through her chest. The house looked the same, old, a bit weathered, but still standing strong. The porch light flickered as if uncertain, a weak beacon in the darkness. Maria parked her car, her hands stiff on the wheel. She took a deep breath before stepping out into the cold night air. The door to the house was already open, the interior barely lit by a single lamp. The stillness of the place was unnerving. She hadn't expected the silence to hit her like this. She thought she was prepared. But she wasn't. As she stepped into the house, the door creaked behind her. No one was waiting in the hallway. No familiar face, no comforting presence. Just darkness, and a lingering tension in the air that she couldn't quite place. Mom? Maria called, her voice tentative. A figure appeared in the dim light, her mother, standing at the top of the stairs. Maria felt a rush of relief at seeing her, but the sight of her mother's pale face, the deep shadows under her eyes, made her hesitate. You came, her mother whispered, her voice thin, shaky. Of course, I came. What's going on? You're scaring me. Maria's voice trembled despite her attempts to remain calm. Her mother didn't answer immediately. She just stood there, staring at Maria as if unsure whether to speak or not. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, her mother spoke again. "Come upstairs," she said, her voice low. "There's someone I want you to meet." Maria followed her mother up the stairs, the quiet thud of their footsteps the only sound in the house. When they reached the top, her mother stopped in front of a door, her father's old office. It was the room Maria had avoided for years. After her father's death, it had remained untouched, locked away with all the things she couldn't face. It was a room full of secrets, things that Maria had never wanted to know. Her mother opened the door slowly, revealing a dimly lit room. And there, standing in the corner, was a man Maria had never seen before. Tall, with sharp features and a gaze that seemed to pierce right through her. He held a thick folder in his hand, his expression unreadable. "Who is this?" Maria asked, her voice rising slightly. She felt a knot tighten in her stomach. What was going on here? Her mother didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped aside, motioning for Maria to enter the room. "This is Jack. He has something to show you." "Something about your father," her mother said quietly. Maria stared at the man, confused and alarmed. "What about my father?" Jack took a step forward, his eyes locked on hers. "Your father wasn't who you think he was," he said, his voice low but firm. "I have evidence. I need you to see this." Maria felt a wave of nausea rise in her chest. She didn't know if she was ready for this. She didn't know if she wanted to hear whatever it was Jack had to say. But she had no choice. She stepped forward, her eyes flicking to the folder in Jack's hands. He handed it to her wordlessly, and as she opened it, a single photograph slipped out and landed on the floor. It was a picture of her father, only it wasn't a picture she recognized. It was from a time before Maria had been born, and in it, her father was standing beside a woman who was not her mother. The caption beneath the photograph read, "Your father's biggest secret." Maria's hands trembled as she picked up the photograph. She glanced at her mother, who stood there, her face as pale as a ghost. "This is just the beginning," Jack said. "There's much more." Maria felt her mind reel. What was going on? What had her father been hiding all these years? Maria's heart raced as her brother, Tony, rushed into the room. His face was pale, and his clothes were damp with sweat. The frantic look in his eyes made Maria's stomach churn. "What do you mean, it's happening?" she asked, her voice shaking. She looked at her mother, who was still standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't have time to explain it all," Tony said quickly, his voice thick with urgency. "But you need to come with me. It's all connected to what Dad was hiding. All of it." Maria glanced at the photograph still in her hands, the image of her father with the unknown woman. The mysterious file Jack had given her still lay open on the desk, but the words and images inside made no sense yet. Her head was spinning. She had always believed her family's secrets were behind them, buried in the past. But tonight, the truth seemed to be clawing its way out of the shadows, and it was threatening to swallow her whole. Her eyes met her mother's, silently asking if she should follow Tony. Her mother nodded, her lips trembling as if she were about to speak, but no words came out. Without waiting for another second, Maria walked out of the room, her brother ahead of her, guiding her down the long hallway. The house seemed colder now, the walls closing in as if the past were trying to trap them in its web. "What do you mean by, it's happening?" "Tony, you're scaring me," Maria said, her voice urgent. "I know," he replied, his voice tight with fear. "But I don't know how else to explain it. Everything's coming back. The things Dad was involved in, the things he kept hidden from all of us. I never thought it would come to this." They reached the end of the hallway, where the stairs led down to the basement. Tony hesitated at the top for a moment, looking at the door that led into the dark, damp space below. Maria's gut tightened. The basement had always been a place of mystery in their house. It was the one room her father had forbidden them from entering when they were children. He'd always said it was too dangerous down there, that it was best left untouched. But now, in the face of everything that had happened tonight, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that it held the answers to the questions they had been avoiding for years. "We're going into the basement?" Maria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Tony replied, his hand gripping the door handle. "But you need to understand something first, Maria. Everything we knew about our family, everything we thought we knew about Dad, it's all a lie." Maria's breath caught in her throat. She stared at Tony, unable to comprehend what he was saying. "What do you mean? How can you say that?" "Because," Tony said, looking her directly in the eyes, "our father wasn't just hiding an affair. He wasn't just hiding his past from us. He was hiding a life, a whole other life that none of us knew about." Maria's mind raced as the words sank in. A whole other life? What did that even mean? And why had their father kept such a thing from them? The photograph of the woman in his arms seemed to mock her now, as though it held the key to unlocking everything. Tony turned the handle and pushed the basement door open. The smell of damp wood and dust hit Maria's nose immediately. The basement was dark, but she could make out the faint outline of old furniture, boxes, and stacks of papers. The air was thick with something she couldn't quite identify. "Come on," Tony urged, stepping into the darkness. He reached for a light switch and flipped it on. The dim, flickering light above them did little to chase away the shadows. They descended the stairs, and Maria's heart pounded louder with each step. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking deeper into something that would change everything. At the bottom of the stairs, Tony stopped abruptly. He stood in front of a large, rusted door that had always been locked. Maria had never seen it before, and she wondered what could be behind it. "Is this where you've been?" Maria asked, a note of disbelief in her voice. Tony turned to her, his face grim. This is where everything started." He stepped forward and pulled something from his pocket, an old, rusted key. The sight of it made Maria's pulse spike. This was it. This was the moment when the past would finally reveal itself. Tony slid the key into the lock, and with a soft click, the door creaked open. The cold air from within rushed out, making Maria shiver. She glanced back at her mother, who was now standing at the top of the stairs, watching them with wide, fearful eyes. Her gaze seemed distant, as if she were watching something unfold that she couldn't control. Tony motioned for Maria to follow him inside. "You need to see this," he said, his voice tinged with both fear and urgency. Maria stepped into the room, her breath catching as her eyes adjusted to the dim light. What she saw inside made her freeze. The room was filled with boxes, old furniture, and piles of yellowed papers. But it wasn't the clutter that made Maria's heart stop. It was the walls. They were covered in photographs. Dozens of them. All of them were of people Maria didn't recognize. In the center of the room was a large desk, stacked high with more files. But it was what lay on the desk that sent a chill through Maria. On top of the pile of papers was a notebook. The pages were old, brittle, but as she stepped closer, she could make out the familiar handwriting. It was her father's. Tony stepped forward and opened the notebook, flipping through the pages until he stopped at one. His hand trembled as he pointed to a particular page. Maria leaned over, her eyes scanning the text. It didn't make sense at first, but as she read further, a name jumped out at her. The Raven Project. The words felt like a punch to the gut. She had heard whispers about the Raven Project before, but never this clearly, never with such detail. It was an operation that had supposedly been buried for years. No one spoke of it, not even her father. Maria felt as if she were on the edge of a precipice, staring into the unknown. "What is this?" Maria whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's everything, Maria," Tony replied, his eyes dark. This is what he was really involved in. This is why he kept so many secrets. This is what he was trying to protect us from. Maria's hands shook as she read the rest of the page. It spoke of covert operations, classified documents, and a secret organization that had ties to governments all over the world. There were mentions of high-level decisions, manipulations, and promises broken. And at the end, the final sentence hit Maria like a bolt of lightning. Maria's heart raced as she looked at Jack, who stood at the door with a look of sheer panic in his eyes. The urgency in his voice sent a chill down her spine. "They're coming," he repeated, his tone laced with fear. "You don't have much time." Tony's face turned pale as he rushed toward Jack. "Who's coming, Jack? What's going on?" Jack glanced around, his eyes flicking nervously to the piles of documents on the desk and the photographs on the walls. "It's them," he said in a hushed voice. "The people your father was trying to protect you from. They're coming to finish what he started. And now, it's too late." Maria felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Her mind raced, trying to process everything that had happened in the last few hours. First, the photograph of her father with the mysterious woman. Then, the cryptic file Jack had handed her, filled with questions about her father's secret life. And now, this. The Raven Project. The classified operation her father had been involved in. Whatever it wasn't just a story about a past long forgotten. It was something real, and dangerous. "Who are these people?" Maria asked, her voice trembling. "Why are they after us?" Jack's eyes shifted to the shadows, as if he feared someone was listening. "I can't explain everything right now. It's too risky. But you need to understand this, your father wasn't just some ordinary man. He was deeply involved in something far bigger than any of us realized." Tony stepped forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "Stop with the cryptic talk, Jack. What is the Raven Project? What does all this have to do with our father?" Jack hesitated before speaking again, his voice barely above a whisper. "The Raven Project was a secret operation, one that your father was a part of. It was created to control and manipulate world events in ways most people wouldn't believe. Your father was one of the masterminds behind it. But somewhere along the way, he had a change of heart. He realized the project was spiraling out of control. That's why he tried to get out, why he tried to protect you both." Maria took a step back, her mind struggling to keep up with the gravity of Jack's words. Her father, a man she had always seen as a loving parent, a protector, had been involved in something that powerful? Something that dangerous? "Why didn't he tell us?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Why keep us in the dark?" Jack's eyes darkened. "Because he knew they'd come after you. They would do anything to keep the project secret. They'd stop at nothing to protect their interests. Your father made a choice, he chose to protect his family, even if it meant cutting ties with the very people he had worked with." Maria could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. "But why now? Why are they coming for us now? It's been years." "Because your father's secret is finally out," Jack said, his gaze hardening. "And they can't afford to let it get out of hand." Tony walked over to the desk, his eyes scanning the papers. "We need to find out everything. We need to know what we're up against." Maria nodded. "What's in the rest of those files, Jack? What else did Dad hide?" Jack hesitated, clearly reluctant to speak, but he finally sighed and walked toward the desk. "Your father's decision to protect you is what sealed his fate. He couldn't keep running, couldn't keep hiding from the people who had been controlling everything. The files in front of you, they're just the tip of the iceberg." Maria and Tony moved toward the desk, their eyes glued to the open notebook. The more they read, the more the pieces began to fall into place. The Raven Project was no ordinary covert operation. It wasn't just about gathering intelligence or making strategic decisions for political gain. The project had been about control over world leaders, control over global events, and most shockingly, control over people's lives. Maria scanned the pages, her heart racing as she came across a section that detailed a group known as the Overseers. They were the ones who ran the Raven Project, the ones who answered to no government, no nation. They were a shadow organization, operating in the dark corners of the world, pulling the strings behind every major world event. They had agents everywhere, police forces, intelligence agencies, and even in the highest offices of power. But it wasn't just their power that terrified Maria. It was the secrecy surrounding them. They operated in complete silence, with no trace of their existence. No one knew who they were, where they came from, or who was behind them. Overseers? Tony repeated, his voice low. This is insane. How could Dad be a part of something like this? I don't know, Jack replied, his voice barely a whisper. But he was. And now, those people are looking for you. They're coming because they know you have the evidence. They know you know too much. Maria's mind was spinning. She had grown up in a world of normalcy, a life free from the chaos Jack was describing. Her father had been her rock, the one person she could always rely on. But now, as she looked at the files in front of her, the man she had loved and trusted seemed like a stranger. He wasn't the father she had known, he was someone else entirely. Then we need to burn everything, Tony said suddenly, his voice full of determination. We can't risk them finding out what we know. Maria shook her head. No. We can't just destroy the evidence. We need to figure out what this is all about. If we destroy everything, we'll never understand what's really going on. We don't have time for that. Tony shot back. They'll be here any minute. Jack was silent for a moment before he spoke again, his voice calm but urgent. Listen to me, both of you. If you want to survive, you need to get out of here. Now. Maria looked at him, confused. What do you mean? We can't just leave. They know who you are, Jack said, his voice hard. And they won't stop until they get what they want. You can't stay here. It's too dangerous. Tony took a step back, his fists clenching. And where are we supposed to go? Jack's gaze hardened. You need to find your father's hidden safe house. It's the only place that's still secure. If you can get there, you might be able to find the rest of the answers. But you can't stay here. You can't stay in this house. Maria felt a wave of panic rise within her. The safe house. That was something her father had mentioned once or twice, but he had always been vague about it. She had no idea where it was or how to get there. Jack seemed to read her mind. It's in the mountains, about 2 hours outside the city. He never told you because he never wanted you to be involved in any of this. But now, it's your only chance. Tony turned to Maria, his face determined. We're going, Maria. We don't have a choice. Maria swallowed hard. She wasn't ready for this. She wasn't ready to step into a world she didn't understand, a world of shadows and danger. But she knew that Jack was right. There was no other option. Let's go, Maria said, her voice steady despite the fear rising inside her. We'll figure this out. We have to. As they made their way out of the basement and toward the front door, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking straight into the unknown. She had no idea what awaited them, but one thing was certain, nothing would ever be the same again. Maria's breath caught in her throat as the headlights of the car illuminated the driveway. Her mind raced. She had no idea who was behind the wheel, but the fact that someone had just pulled up at her house at this late hour could mean only one thing: the overseers had found them. Tony's eyes widened. They're here, he muttered, his voice filled with a mix of fear and determination. "We don't have time. Let's go." Maria's hands trembled as she grabbed her jacket and shoved the files into her bag. The truth of Jack's words was sinking in. They weren't just running from shadows. They were running from a network of powerful individuals with their own agenda, a network that would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. "Where do we go?" Maria whispered, panic creeping into her voice. Jack grabbed her by the arm. His grip was firm, but his expression was filled with urgency. "Get to the back door. We'll take the alley. They won't expect you to go that way." The alley behind their house led to a narrow street that eventually turned into a network of side roads. If they could make it out undetected, they might have a chance at finding the safe house Jack had mentioned earlier. Tony was already heading toward the back door. "Let's move. We don't have time to waste." Maria hesitated for a split second, looking back toward the driveway. The car was still parked there, the engine purring as the headlights flickered, casting long shadows across the yard. Whoever was in that car had to be waiting for something. She could almost feel their eyes on her, watching, waiting for the moment when she would make a mistake. She quickly turned and ran toward the back door, following Jack and Tony. Her footsteps echoed in the stillness of the night, but she couldn't let the sound slow her down. She had to focus. She had to survive. The alley was dark, the only light coming from the distant streetlights at the end of the road. The cool air bit at her skin, but she barely noticed. Her mind was consumed with one thought: escape. "We need to get to the safe house," Tony said, his voice urgent. "Where exactly is it?" Jack glanced over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the street. "It's in the mountains, 2 hours outside the city. We'll need to find a car." Maria felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had no idea how they would make it there without being caught. The city was crawling with surveillance cameras, and they had no idea how many people were working for the overseers. The odds were stacked against them. But Jack's words kept ringing in her mind: "This is the only chance you have." They continued moving swiftly through the alley, the quiet hum of the car engine growing fainter with every step. As they reached the end of the alley, Jack signaled for them to stop. He pressed himself against the wall, listening intently. The streets were silent, save for the distant sounds of the city. "I think they're waiting for us to make a move," Jack said softly. "They know we're here, but they don't know which way we're going." Maria nodded, trying to steady her breathing. She glanced at Tony, who was tense, his eyes scanning every shadow. His body language told her everything she needed to know. He was ready for anything, but the fear was still there. They all felt it. "We'll take the side road," Jack continued. "It's less traveled, and it should lead us to a gas station. We can get a car there." They moved quickly, keeping to the shadows as they walked down the narrow side road. The silence was deafening, broken only by their hurried footsteps. Maria's mind raced, and the weight of everything that had happened in the past few hours pressed down on her chest. She kept wondering what her father had known, what he had been involved in, and why he had kept it all a secret. He had always been a man of principle, so why had he gotten mixed up in something as dangerous as the Raven Project? The side road was empty, but they still didn't dare speak above a whisper. Every streetlight they passed felt like it could be their last. They needed to get to safety, and quickly. The further they went, the more Maria felt the pull of the unknown, the strange sense that they were being watched, that the answers they were looking for were just out of reach. Eventually, they reached the gas station, a small, run-down place at the corner of a deserted intersection. There was a car parked in front, a faded sedan that looked like it had seen better days. "Stay low," Jack whispered. "We'll take the car. If anyone sees us, we're done." Maria nodded and followed Jack and Tony as they approached the car. The old vehicle seemed to blend in with the surroundings, but Maria felt uneasy. Every minute they spent out in the open felt like a minute closer to being discovered. Tony quickly checked the doors. "It's unlocked," he said, his voice filled with relief. "Let's go." They piled into the sedan, Jack taking the driver's seat and Tony sitting beside him. Maria climbed into the back, her heart pounding as she buckled up. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The quiet was too deep, the night too still. Jack started the engine, and the car sputtered to life. "We're good. We're on our way." They drove through the empty streets, the headlights cutting through the darkness. Maria tried to relax, but every corner felt like a trap, every passing car a potential threat. Her mind raced, but she knew there was no turning back now. They were in it for the long haul. As the city gave way to the outskirts and the roads became less familiar, Maria began to feel the weight of the situation settle over her. The further they drove, the more the city seemed to fade away. Soon, they were surrounded by nothing but darkness, and the only sounds were the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of the wind. Maria turned to Jack, who was focused on the road ahead. "Jack, why didn't my father tell us about this? Why didn't he warn us?" Jack's hands tightened on the steering wheel, and for a moment, he was silent. Then, in a low voice, he said, "He couldn't. He didn't have a choice." "What do you mean?" Maria pressed, her voice shaking. Jack glanced at her briefly before returning his attention to the road. "The Raven Project, it's bigger than you think. Your father was trying to protect you, but there were things he couldn't control. The overseers, they're everywhere. And once they get you in their sights, there's no escape." Maria's chest tightened. "So, we're running because they want to keep this secret?" "That's part of it," Jack replied. "But the real reason is that your father knew something that could destroy them. That's why they're coming for you now." Maria's mind reeled. What could her father have known? What was so dangerous that they would risk everything to silence him? As the car sped further into the night, Maria felt a sense of dread settle over her. They were on their way to the safe house, but even that didn't feel safe. Every shadow could be hiding an enemy, every turn a trap. The truth was closer than ever, but so was the danger. And she had no idea what they were about to uncover. The headlights grew brighter as the car behind them steadily closed the distance. Maria's heart hammered in her chest as she turned to Jack, her voice barely a whisper. "Are we being followed?" Jack didn't respond immediately. His grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles white in the dim light of the dashboard. He accelerated, pushing the old sedan harder, but the car behind them remained glued to their tail. "Damn it," Jack muttered, his voice filled with urgency. "It's them." Maria's stomach dropped. She knew this wasn't just a coincidence. Whoever was behind them wasn't there by accident. They were being hunted. Tony twisted in his seat, looking out the rearview mirror. His face had turned pale. "We're not outrunning them in this car. We need to do something." "Keep your head down," Jack ordered, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "I'll take care of this." Maria's mind raced, but there was no time to think. They had no escape, no way out. All she could do was trust Jack. And hope he knew what he was doing. The car behind them surged forward, its headlights cutting through the night, illuminating the road ahead. Jack swerved, taking a sharp turn onto a narrow, winding road that led deeper into the countryside. The gravel crunched under the tires as they careened through the darkness, but the pursuing vehicle stayed right on their tail, refusing to give up the chase. Maria could hear the roar of the engine behind them, growing louder with each passing second. She looked at Tony, who was now gripping the armrest, his knuckles pale. "This is bad," he muttered, his eyes wide with fear. "We're not getting away this easily," Jack said, his eyes scanning the road ahead as he turned the wheel sharply, narrowly avoiding a ditch. He glanced at Maria in the rearview mirror. "Buckle up. It's going to get bumpy." Maria's pulse quickened as the car lurched, swerving through the sharp turns. The headlights of the car behind them flashed like a warning beacon, relentless in their pursuit. They were in trouble, and there was nowhere to run. "Where are we going?" Maria asked, her voice rising with panic. "What's the plan?" "We need to get to the safe house," Jack said, his voice tense but focused. "That's our only shot. It's hidden deep in the mountains. If we can make it there, we'll be safe." "Safe from what?" Tony asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "They're everywhere. We won't be safe anywhere." Jack's jaw tightened as he took another sharp turn, sending the car skidding across the gravel. "We have to try. There's nowhere else to go." Maria could feel the sweat on her brow as the car bounced over the rough terrain. The road seemed to narrow with each passing mile, the trees growing denser on either side. It was as if the forest itself was closing in on them, trapping them in its embrace. But still, the car behind them followed, unrelenting, its headlights shining like the eyes of a predator. They rounded another bend, and suddenly, the road opened up into a clearing. A small cabin stood in the center, its lights dim but welcoming in the vast darkness. Maria's heart skipped a beat. The safe house. They had made it. Jack slammed on the brakes as they skidded to a stop in front of the cabin. "Get out. Now," he barked. Tony didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled out of the car, and Maria followed, her legs shaky as she stood on the gravel. They ran for the door, but as Maria reached for the handle, she froze. A dark figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted by the soft light inside. It was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, his face obscured by the shadows. "Who are you?" Maria demanded, her voice trembling. The man stepped forward, his face coming into view. Maria gasped. It was someone she knew. Someone she never thought she'd see again. "Dad?" Maria whispered, disbelief in her voice. The man gave her a wry smile, though there was something almost sinister about it. "It's been a long time, Maria." Maria's knees buckled beneath her, and for a moment, she thought she might collapse. She had known something was off about this whole situation, but she never expected this. The man in front of her, this stranger, looked so much like her father that it took her breath away. But how was that possible? Before she could say anything else, Jack's voice cut through the confusion. "We don't have time for this. We're being followed." The man's expression shifted, his eyes narrowing. "You're not the only ones being hunted." Maria's mind spun as she tried to make sense of the situation. Her father was dead, or so she thought. She had seen him in the hospital after the accident. His funeral had been weeks ago. How could he be standing in front of her now? "Come inside," the man said, stepping aside to let them in. "It's not safe out here." Reluctantly, Maria followed Jack and Tony into the cabin, still reeling from the shock. She couldn't understand what was happening, but she had to stay focused. The danger wasn't over. Whatever was going on, whoever this man was, they couldn't afford to be distracted. They needed answers. Inside, the cabin was small but cozy, with a roaring fire crackling in the hearth. The man gestured for them to sit, but Maria remained standing, her eyes fixed on him. "I don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "You look just like my father." "But you..." The man's face softened, and he looked down for a moment. "I know. It's complicated." "Complicated?" Maria echoed, her confusion growing. "How can this be happening? My father, he died. How are you here?" He sighed deeply, then looked her in the eyes. "I am your father's twin brother. But you were never meant to know about me." Maria's breath caught in her throat. "Twin brother?" "Yes," the man said, his voice quiet but firm. "You see, Maria, your father wasn't just a simple man. He was part of something much bigger. And when the truth comes out, everything you thought you knew will be turned upside down. Maria stood frozen, the weight of his words crashing down on her. Her father had a twin brother? And he was involved in something bigger? The questions were endless, but one thing was clear, the mystery was far from over. The sound of a car screeching to a halt outside made them all freeze. They weren't alone. "We don't have much time," the man said, his eyes hardening. "Get to the back. I'll cover you." Maria's heart raced as she followed Jack and Tony to the back of the cabin. She could feel the tension in the air. Whoever was outside was closing in, and they had no idea who or what they were dealing with. Maria's heart thudded in her chest as the voice echoed through the cabin. "We know you're in there. Come out, Maria. It's over." She froze, unable to move. The man who had claimed to be her father's twin brother, this stranger, who seemed to know everything, was right behind her. She could feel his breath, cold and steady, on the back of her neck. Jack was tense, his hand resting lightly on the door, ready to push it open and make a run for it if they needed to. But Maria's mind was a whirlwind. What was going on? Who was outside? And how did they know her name? The man behind her stepped forward, his expression grim. "You need to stay calm. They won't stop until they have you." Maria turned to face him, her emotions swirling. "Who are they? What do they want with me?" His face softened for a moment, but there was no time to explain. He looked toward the window, his eyes scanning the darkness outside. The sound of footsteps grew louder. He turned back to them. "They'll break down that door if we don't leave. Now." Jack grabbed Maria's arm. "We need to move, Maria." Tony was already at the back of the room, peering through the small window. His voice came out in a frantic whisper. "There's more than one. They're surrounding the cabin. We don't have a chance." The man stepped toward the back door, his eyes never leaving the window. "Listen to me, Maria. We don't have much time. You have to trust me." Maria felt a chill run through her veins. Her father had died weeks ago. She had seen his body, watched as they lowered him into the ground. Yet, here was this man, claiming to be her father's twin brother, telling her she had to trust him. She swallowed hard, shaking her head. "This doesn't make any sense. Who are you really? What's going on? How can you be here?" His eyes locked onto hers, filled with a sorrow that cut through her confusion. "I am your father's brother, Maria. Your father was a part of something larger than you'll ever understand. He had to hide the truth from you, to protect you." The door shuddered under a violent impact from the other side. They were running out of time. "Protect me?" Maria's voice was barely a whisper. "From what?" The man's eyes flashed, his gaze intense. "From the people who will stop at nothing to use you for their own gain. Your father, he made sacrifices to keep you safe. But now they know you're here. And they'll stop at nothing to get you." Before Maria could respond, the back door burst open with a deafening crash. A figure in black stormed in, wielding a gun. The figure was tall, imposing, and covered from head to toe in tactical gear. His eyes were hidden behind a black mask, but the aura of danger was unmistakable. "Don't move," the man commanded in a low, menacing tone. Jack instinctively moved in front of Maria, but the man grabbed him by the collar and threw him to the side with ease. Tony lunged, trying to tackle the intruder, but was met with a brutal strike to the chest that sent him crashing to the floor. Maria's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just a random encounter. These people were trained, and they were after her. She needed answers, now. Father's twin stepped forward, his hands raised in surrender. "I told you, they won't stop. We have to go." But the intruder didn't seem fazed. "You think running is going to save you?" he sneered, stepping closer. "You're not getting away this time." Maria could hear her heart pounding in her ears as her mind raced. Who was this man? Why did he want her? Get down, the intruder shouted. Before Maria could react, the man behind her's hand shot out. He slammed the intruder to the floor with an impossible speed, knocking the weapon from his hand. The masked man scrambled, reaching for his gun, but the twin brother was faster, grabbing the man's arm and twisting it with brutal force. The man screamed, but the twin brother didn't let go. You won't take her, he said, his voice cold and resolute. Not today. Maria felt a surge of relief, but the fear didn't fade. There were more of them outside. They weren't done yet. Is this what you meant? Maria whispered, her voice shaky. You said I was being hunted. But why? Why me? The twin brother stood over the intruder, breathing heavily. He glanced over at her, his face hard. Your father, he wasn't who you thought he was. He was involved in something bigger, something that goes back decades. And they're not just after you. They're after the knowledge you hold. Maria felt her pulse quicken. Knowledge? What do you mean? The truth your father kept from you. The secret he buried. He had access to information, something that could change the world. And you've inherited it. Maria felt the weight of his words settle like a heavy stone in her stomach. Inherited? How? I don't know anything about that. The man's eyes narrowed. You don't know yet. But soon, you will. And when you do, you'll understand why they won't stop until they get it. Maria's mind was spinning, but there was no time to process it. The sound of footsteps, but as they drove further into the darkness, Maria's mind was a blur of questions. She had come looking for answers, but now all she had were more questions. Her father's twin brother? Knowledge that could change the world? What was going on? And who were the people hunting her? What was the secret her father had hidden? And why had they left her with nothing but a lifetime of lies? She glanced at Jack, who was focused on the road ahead, his jaw clenched with determination. He was always the strong one, the calm one. But even he seemed to be unraveling at the edges. They all were. They weren't safe. Not yet. But as the headlights illuminated the empty road ahead, Maria realized one thing for sure: the truth was out there, and she was going to find it, no matter what.